While there are those that believe that the late 1970s and early 1980s were a dead spot in terms of interest for classic kaiju films, Toho's most famous monster, Godzilla, and other giant monster or kaiju films were still a common sight on local television stations, both late at night and on lazy Saturday afternoons. During this time, Godzilla and his monster kin were finding their way into all kinds of popular media. Godzilla himself briefly joined the Marvel Comics universe and became the star of a Hanna Barbera cartoon that was popular on Saturday mornings. Being a kid at this time, it felt like interest in Godzilla was gaining momentum, not faltering, and this led to some of the best and most interesting Godzilla toys ever made. We start our journey into the mists of Monster Island history with one of the greatest Godzilla toys ever created, the Godzilla vs. the Tricephalon playset by HG Toys from 1979. The playset fit into the standard playset format that had been made popular by the Marx Toy Company over a decade prior. It included tiny plastic army men, tiny plastic civilians, some military machines such as jeeps and tanks, police cars and ambulances, a couple of plastic jets, and even a large plastic battleship to fight the monsters. The art on the box was one of the best parts, with a heavily T-Rex inspired Godzilla as interpreted by artist Earl Norem, fighting the three-headed Tricephalon monster. Like many of the playsets at this time, the set included cardboard structures and trees, and even a cardboard cityscape as a background. The whole thing was brought together with a large printed plastic playmat, like a good rug in the dude's room. But the real stars of the show were the monster figures. The playset came with great-looking Godzilla and Tricephalon monster figures to rampage through your cardboard metropolis. And this was a pretty good-looking Godzilla, especially for the time, as we'll see when we look at other contemporaneous Godzilla toys. And while it was not painted, it was textured and pretty nicely detailed. And the Tricephalon was a neat concept and was also pretty nicely sculpted, but this would not be the only time that this creature would appear in an HG Toys playset. The Tricephalon, sometimes missing a couple of heads, would be included as a dragon in their Sword and Sorcery playsets that would come out a few years later. I talk about these playsets in my video on Sword and Sorcery playsets from the 1980s. And I should mention that the Tricephalon was not an official Godzilla enemy, but one specifically created for this playset. I still thought it was a great toy as a kid, and I think that I just thought it was a messed up version of King Ghidorah. A lot of toys got the details wrong in the 1980s, and it seemed that we just accepted it. But this playset was not the only Godzilla product that HG Toys would produce in the late 1970s. They also produced 4 puzzles. One puzzle, the one that depicted Godzilla's battle with the Tricephalon, had only 100 pieces, but it seemed that the other 3 had about 150. All of the puzzles featured artwork by Earl Norem, who was well known for many great 1980s toy depictions, among other things. The Godzilla had a real dinosaur look about him that I found strange but appealing as a child. But there was still so many more toys and products featuring Godzilla offered at this time. Godzilla even had his own action figure line, the brief Godzilla's Gang toy line. The toy line was produced by Mattel in 1978, but it was actually based on a Japanese toy line from Bendy. It consisted of 8 Kaiju monster action figures, averaging about 6 inches tall. The figures were packed in plastic bags that were sealed with a printed cardboard top. All of the monsters, except for Godzilla, actually originated from the Ultraman series, and I remember a lot of kids not knowing who they were. So let's take a closer look at the 8 monster figures. One of the neatest features about this toy line is that the figures featured a unique footprint at the bottom of each of their feet, so they knows who squished them. And Mattel would go on to produce a Godzilla game that same year. In this game, you played as different colored spaceships and took turns flying in circles. And every so often, Godzilla would pull an ambush attack, pop out, and grab one of the ships. The game was a strange mix of Godzilla and space themes, appealing to both the Godzilla and Star Wars enthusiasts in every kid from that time period. Mattel would produce other Godzilla and Kaiju toys during this time period, and we're going to get back to them. But they were far from the only ones producing Godzilla action figures in the late 1970s. This small Godzilla figure was produced by GLJ Toys in 1978. This 6-inch tall toy was one of those rubber figures that used internal metal wires to allow it to bend into different poses. This type of toy was a staple of cheap toy shelves and had been around a long time, and it continues to be produced in some form or another to this day. The real gem of this toy line was the packaging, which depicted the little rubber monster rampaging through a small model town. Man, I loved this picture as a kid. The Bendy Godzilla figure came packaged on a blister card that depicted this scene of toy monster mayhem. But there were still more Godzilla figures available at this time. The company Ben Cooper, famous for its plastic Halloween costumes and small rubber toys, would also produce their own version of the King of Monsters. Sold out of those cardboard display boxes, this Godzilla was pretty far from accurate. It was included in their Weirdy Wiggly toy line, which included bugs, snakes, and alligator toys. The Ben Cooper version of the Great Lizard was a lot closer to a small rubber dinosaur than the Godzilla that we all know and fear. And of course, this type of toy was really popular at the time period, and the small rubber dinosaurs that were sold in this fashion became a staple toy for many kids in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I discussed these toys in my previous video on vintage dinosaur toys. This Godzilla really fit in with those prolific prehistoric beasts, and had a lot of features in common with them. Ben Cooper would also produce a boxed Godzilla costume for kids to wear at Halloween. And of course, Ben Cooper was known for its plastic smock-type costumes that came complete with molded plastic masks held in place by a rubber band. These costumes were another staple from this time period, and the masks in particular are still considered precious works of art, works of cultural and historic significance. Well, at least they should be. This mask, in my opinion, was one of the best ever made. But now, to truly understand the monster toy zeitgeist of the time, we have to circle back to several other master works of cultural and historic significance created by Mattel. I held off a little on covering these since I just covered them in my video on giant monster toys, and there will be some repeat of the same information on these toys in this video. But these toys were too important to Godzilla toy history to leave out, especially from this time period. We will continue to look at more toys than just these as we move through the video. These were some of the most popular toys from this time period, and some of the most influential Godzilla toys ever created, especially in the United States. This Godzilla figure was created by Mattel in 1977, and was originally part of the Shogun Warriors toy line. He stood a towering 20 inches tall. This toy featured wheels on its feet to aid in mobility and a spring-powered launching fist. As I discussed before, the launching fist was actually really powerful, and my Shogun Warriors Godzilla had a hair trigger. Sometimes randomly, the fist would launch accidentally and knock the wind out of me. But this Godzilla had another great feature. Pulling a large red lever on the back of his head made his fiery tongue shoot forward out of his mouth to mimic Godzilla's famous fiery atomic breath. The head sculpt that Mattel went with was a pretty far cry from the Godzilla on the silver screen, and he was different than the version of this toy that was released in Japan. He had a head that resembled Sputnik, spherical but quite pointy at parts. He also lacked the signature large dorsal plates. Still, he was one of the best toys ever made. With the success of the large Godzilla action figure, Mattel would go on to produce the avian reptile Rodan in 1979 as a frenemy to the big green monster. The Rodan didn't stand as tall as the Godzilla toy, but he was 38 inches from wingtip to wingtip. Quite an impressive wingspan. This Rodan also had quite a few unique play features all its own. Rodan featured rubber band powered grasping claws, wings that flapped when you shook him up and down, and a lever on the back of his neck that moved his jaw up and down and created clicking noise that was supposed to be interpreted as squawking. Spoiler, it really just sounded like clicking plastic. And that's going to bring us to 1985. The toy company Imperial, known for their cheap rubber monster and dinosaur toys, got the license to produce official Godzilla toys and merchandise, and they would go on to produce some of the most fondly remembered Godzilla toys of the 1980s. And this guy was one of the most popular of them all. This was the Imperial Godzilla figure. He was sold in different forms, but the most popular and probably most fondly remembered is out of those large display boxes like those earlier Ben Cooper Godzilla figures. Imperial produced both Godzilla and King Kong figures during this time. They were relatively cheap and found all over the place. And this Godzilla figure was actually manufactured in two different sizes. One that measured about 6 inches tall, and another that stood about 13 inches high, but they used basically the same mold. Though it was most commonly sold out of those large display boxes, Imperial also offered these Godzilla toys on blister cards to be hung on toy racks. And Imperial was not the only toy manufacturer that wanted in on that gargantuan kaiju money. Other toy companies who were also producing those cheap rubber dinosaurs and monsters like Dorme were already producing Godzilla-like monsters. These guys were usually giant, often measuring between 13 and 14 inches tall, and usually were articulated at the neck, arms, legs, and tail. They came in a pretty wide variety of paint jobs, and often the sculpts were slightly different. Sometimes they had head fins, and other times they had larger or more pronounced brow ridges, or even ridged spines. The wide availability and low price point meant that they were a pretty common sight during this time. But Imperial was never the type of company to put all of its cheap rubber dragon eggs into one kaiju-sized display basket. Imperial was going to offer a lot of Godzilla merchandise, and many of these products would go on to become as well known as the rubber dinosaur, dragon, and kaiju action figures. One of these products is this special little guy, the Spark-E Godzilla. Offered on a blister card, this was one of those, let's just say, lower price point molded plastic toys that moved around on little wheels and shot sparks from its mouth. This style of toy actually made the most sense in many ways as a Godzilla, since a spark-spewing King Kong or monster from the Black Lagoon made a lot less sense. You know, now looking at it, I actually think the knockoff Godzilla toy looks better than the official one. But Imperial Toys still had more products to offer. This is the bubble-blowing Godzilla toy. It replaces Godzilla's destructive atomic breath with bubbles. I kind of think the play value of this toy was probably pretty limited, but if you like bubbles, then this is the Godzilla toy for you. And Imperial would also offer some of the most influential Godzilla inflatable toys that the world would ever know. Let's start with the Godzilla Bop Bag. These Bop Bags were everywhere for decades and adorned with everyone from Superman to the Incredible Hulk to Darth Vader. Now it was Godzilla's turn to adorn a Bop Bag and get hit by kids with emotional issues around the world. Look at the kid in the picture. He's only seeing his divorced parents in that bag in shades of red. Next, we have a Godzilla product that was seen everywhere in the mid-1980s, including in several television shows and movies, the giant inflatable Godzilla. This thing came in different sizes, but the most common, I believe, was the 6-foot-tall version. And yes, the inflatable Godzilla is strangling the kid from the Bop Bag box that we saw before. He was tired of his crap. And the last little bit of Godzilla merchandise from this time period we're going to look at is these two plushies from the company Knickerbocker. These plushies were based on the Godzilla and his nephew Godzuki from the Hanna Barbera Saturday morning cartoon that was popular at the time. The plushies were sold in those cardboard display boxes that so many other Godzilla toys were offered in. I guess the Godzilla is a decent representation, except for the Komodo dragon tongue hanging out of his mouth. But the Godzuki is another story altogether. It looks very little like the Godzuki from the show. The color is totally wrong, and you would be hard-pressed to guess this was actually Godzuki unless it had the name Godzuki boldly emblazoned on the chest. See? Now you can see why I thought the Tricephalon was a messed up King Ghidorah. They did these things at the time. I guess toys didn't have to make sense in the 80s. They really had a low opinion of us kids at the time. I guess they thought they could just print a name on anything and perhaps a general depiction, and the kids would just accept that was what it was and move on. Well, I see through your schemes, Knickerbocker, and you sit on a throne of lies. Well, I think we've worried Tokyo enough with this rampage of Godzilla toys from the 1970s and 1980s. Godzilla toys and monster toys in general were, in my opinion, at a bit of a high point during this time. It felt like every time you walked into a Playworld, Toys R Us, or KB, or Circus World, you were treated to a pretty large selection of monster toys and monster-themed products. With new kaiju films hitting the screen regularly both here and in Japan, I can't help but think back at a time when Godzilla was really being introduced to kids in the United States and the products were plentiful. Thanks again for joining us as we looked at some of the Godzilla products from the late 1970s and 1980s. Please hit the like button and subscribe to stay in touch with future content, and continue to join us for more adventures to look into the little things that were locked in primal combat and laid waste to the imaginary cities of our childhoods.